The city was not supposed to wake up to war that morning. It was January 31st, 1968, the start of the Lunar New Year, the most important holiday in Vietnam. For both North and South, Tet was a time of family, food, and prayers for peace. In Saigon, soldiers expected a brief pause in the fighting, a chance to relax after months of jungle patrols. American commanders had even reduced their alerts, believing the enemy would respect the truce. But before dawn, the stillness broke. Explosions cracked across the city. Tracer fire lit up the sky. American Marines at bases outside Saigon jolted awake to the sound of mortars raining down. Within minutes, the war had arrived in the heart of the capital. In the narrow streets, civilians stumbled out of their homes, clutching children, confused and terrified. Shops and pagodas that only hours earlier had been decorated for celebration were now torn by gunfire. Soldiers of the National Liberation Front, the Viet Cong, poured into neighborhoods, rifles in hand, determined to strike at the very core of American power. No one expected it. For months, U.S. leaders had spoken confidently. General William Westmoreland, the top American commander, had told reporters that the enemy was weakening, that victory was within sight. President Lyndon Johnson reassured the public there was light at the end of the tunnel. By every measure the United States used, body counts, firepower, resources, the communists seemed unable to launch a major offensive. And yet, on that morning, more than 80,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers struck across South Vietnam. Over 100 cities, towns, and military bases came under attack at the same time. It was the largest coordinated assault of the entire war. In Saigon, the fighting came shockingly close to symbols of American presence. Viet Cong commandos stormed the U.S. Embassy compound, blasting through the outer wall and exchanging fire with Marines inside. For 6 hours, gunfire rattled through the embassy gardens while American helicopters circled overhead. On live television, Americans back home saw their supposedly secure fortress under siege. Even though the attack was repelled, the image itself was devastating. Further north, in the ancient city of Hue, the offensive turned into one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops seized much of the city, raising their flags over the imperial citadel. For weeks, Marines and South Vietnamese forces fought house to house, block by block. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, and thousands of civilians were caught in the crossfire. Later, mass graves would be discovered. A reminder that the cost of the battle was paid not only by soldiers, but also by ordinary families. For the United States, the Tet Offensive was a paradox. Militarily, American and South Vietnamese troops beat back the attacks, inflicting massive casualties on the communists. By some estimates, more than 40,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese fighters were killed. On paper, it was a victory. But politically, the offensive was a disaster, because on American television screens, the story looked very different. Viewers saw images of U.S. soldiers pinned down in their own bases, of bodies in the streets of Saigon, of cities burning. The confident words of generals and politicians about progress, about turning points, suddenly rang hollow. If the enemy was weak, how could it strike so widely, so ferociously? In Hanoi, the planners of the offensive had hoped for more. They dreamed that the people of South Vietnam would rise up against their government and join the communists. That uprising never came. Many southern villages and towns, instead of joining, were devastated by the fighting. For the Viet Cong, losses were catastrophic. Entire local units wiped out. Yet despite those losses, the offensive achieved something greater. It shattered the image of American control. The United States had promised victory, and Tet showed the world that victory was nowhere near. The shockwave was immediate. In American living rooms, respected news anchor Walter Cronkite, a man often called the most trusted voice in America, told his audience that the war now seemed unwinnable. His sober words carried more weight than any politician's speech. President Johnson himself was reported to have said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." What began as a surprise attack on a holiday morning became a turning point in the entire Vietnam War. It was the day the war changed, not only in the jungles and cities of Vietnam, but in the minds of millions of Americans who no longer believed in what their leaders told them. The fighting in Saigon was unlike anything the Americans had faced before. Until that morning, most battles of the Vietnam War had unfolded in jungles, rice paddies, or remote villages. But now, for the first time, combat raged in the very heart of the South Vietnamese capital. In the early hours of January 31st, a squad of Viet Cong commandos crept through the quiet streets near the U.S. Embassy. Dressed in South Vietnamese police uniforms, they carried rifles, grenades, and explosives hidden in carts. At 2:47 a.m., they detonated a charge against the outer wall and stormed through the breach. Within minutes, they killed 2 American MPs guarding the gate and began firing into the embassy courtyard. Inside, only a handful of Marines were on duty. They scrambled for cover, returning fire through windows and doorways. Reinforcements rushed from nearby bases, but for hours the attackers held their ground. The embassy, symbol of American power in Vietnam, had become a battlefield. News of the assault spread quickly. Reporters arrived, dodging bullets as they filmed the chaos. By dawn, images were already reaching American television screens. Viewers thousands of miles away watched in disbelief as the walls of their own embassy were scarred with bullet holes. To them, it looked as if the enemy had broken into the very core of U.S. authority in Vietnam. By late morning, helicopters dropped reinforcements onto the embassy roof. U.S. forces fought room to room until the last Viet Cong were killed or captured. The siege ended after about 6 hours. Militarily, it was a failure for the attackers. They never entered the Chancery building itself, and all of them were dead or prisoners by noon. But strategically, the damage was done. The world had seen what should have been impossible. American soil, even abroad, under attack. The embassy was not the only target in Saigon. Elsewhere in the city, Viet Cong units struck police stations, radio towers, and government buildings. Some tried to assassinate South Vietnamese officials. Others attempted to seize key intersections. Fierce firefights erupted in the Chinese district of Cho Lon, where narrow alleys and crowded markets became killing grounds. Tanks rumbled through the streets as South Vietnamese troops and American forces fought block by block. For civilians, the shock was unbearable. Families who had prepared for Tet with altars of food and flowers now huddled in basements, listening to gunfire tear apart their neighborhoods. The scent of incense mixed with the acrid smoke of burning buildings. Children clung to their parents, not understanding why the festival of renewal had turned into a day of terror. American soldiers, too, were stunned. Many had believed the war was slowly being won. They were told the enemy could no longer fight in large numbers. Yet here they were, facing coordinated attacks in the middle of Saigon. A young Marine later recalled, "It felt like the ground shifted under us. We thought we were safe, and then suddenly nowhere was safe." Despite the surprise, US and South Vietnamese forces responded quickly. Within a few days, most of the attackers in Saigon were killed or driven out. But the message had already been delivered. The Viet Cong had shown they could strike anywhere, at any time, even in the capital. Meanwhile, the scale of the offensive elsewhere was becoming clear. In more than 100 towns and bases across South Vietnam, similar assaults were unfolding. In places like Ban Mae Thuot, Con Tum, and Quang Tri, fighting raged for days. At the same time, in the far north, US Marines were under siege at Khe Sanh. Pounded by artillery in what many feared would become another disaster like Dien Bien Phu in 1954, American commanders insisted that the offensive was under control. General Westmoreland appeared before cameras, declaring the attacks had been defeated everywhere they occurred. In pure military terms, he was correct. The Viet Cong suffered enormous casualties, far more than the US or South Vietnamese forces. But the damage was not measured only in numbers. What mattered was perception. For the American public, the sight of flames rising over Saigon and gunmen inside their embassy's courtyard destroyed the illusion of the progress. Victory had been promised. But Tet revealed a war that was far from over. South Vietnamese leaders too were shaken. President Nguyen Van Thieu had to reassure his citizens that the government still controlled the capital. But many in Saigon wondered if their country's future could really be secured when the enemy could infiltrate their most guarded city with such ferocity. The battle for Saigon ended in days. Yet the psychological shock lingered much longer. The Americans had won in the streets, but lost in the minds of many who watched the images unfold. And while Saigon tried to recover, another city to the north was descending into a nightmare that would last nearly a month. The Battle of Hue, the most prolonged and brutal urban fight of the Vietnam War. Hue was a city of history and culture, the old imperial capital of Vietnam. With its palaces, temples, and the massive stone walls of the citadel, it was considered the heart of Vietnamese tradition. When the Tet Offensive began, few could imagine that this ancient city would become the scene of one of the war's bloodiest battles. On January 31st, 1968, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops launched a surprise assault on Hue. Within hours, they overran most of the city, seizing government offices, police stations, and entire neighborhoods. Their red and gold flags rose above the citadel walls, a defiant signal that the communists now controlled much of the former imperial capital. For American and South Vietnamese forces, the shock was immense. The city was supposed to be secure, far from the heavy fighting in the countryside. But suddenly, an entire urban center had fallen into enemy hands. The task now was not only to retake Hue, but to fight for it street by street. The battle that followed was unlike anything US Marines had seen since World War II. Urban combat was new to them. The narrow streets, stone buildings, and hidden alleyways turned Hue into a deadly maze. Snipers fired from rooftops. Machine guns rattled from windows. Mortar shells exploded without warning. Every block had to be cleared by force, and every advance came at a heavy cost. Civilians were trapped in the middle. Families huddled in basements while battles raged overhead. Some tried to flee across the Perfume River, braving gunfire and shelling. Others were forced from their homes by occupying forces. For weeks, the city's people lived in constant fear, not knowing who would control their neighborhood tomorrow, or whether their loved ones would survive the night. American Marines entered Hue from the south and west, alongside South Vietnamese troops pushing from other directions. Progress was painfully slow. Buildings that had stood for centuries were blasted apart by artillery and airstrikes. The smell of smoke and death filled the air. One Marine later recalled, "We weren't fighting for ground. We were fighting for walls, for staircases, for every room in every house." The citadel itself became the ultimate battleground. Its massive stone walls and ancient fortifications were turned into strongpoints by North Vietnamese troops. The fight for the citadel dragged on for weeks, with both sides suffering heavy losses. Marines scaled walls under fire, blasted through gates with explosives, and crawled through mud and rubble to dislodge defenders. But the human cost of the battle extended far beyond the soldiers. After the fighting, mass graves were uncovered in and around Hue. Hundreds, possibly thousands of civilians had been executed or died during the occupation. Families discovered loved ones among the dead: teachers, doctors, priests, and ordinary townspeople. The tragedy left scars that would never fully heal. For the Americans, Hue became a symbol of the brutal reality of the war. The victory was costly. More than 200 U.S. troops were killed and over 1,000 wounded. South Vietnamese losses were even higher. Communist casualties numbered in the thousands. But they had shown they could seize and hold a major city, if only for a time. The destruction was staggering. Once a city of beauty, Hue lay in ruins. Entire districts were flattened. Temples and palaces that had survived dynasties now stood shattered. For many Vietnamese, it was a cultural wound as much as a military one. The battle also shocked Americans back home. Footage of Marines dragging wounded comrades through ruined streets aired on nightly news broadcasts. Reporters described the devastation in grim detail. The gap between official statements, claiming progress and control, and the images on television grew impossible to ignore. General Westmoreland insisted the offensive was a failure for the communists. He pointed to their enormous casualties, their inability to trigger a popular uprising, and the eventual recapture of Hue. On paper, it was true. But the pictures told another story. One of chaos, destruction, and a war that seemed endless. For the people of Hue, the battle was not about strategy or politics. It was about survival. Entire families had been uprooted, their homes reduced to rubble. The ancient city they loved was scarred forever. By late February, the citadel finally fell to American and South Vietnamese forces. The communist troops melted back into the jungle, leaving behind devastation and grief. The victory was hollow. Hue was retaken, but at a cost that stunned both soldiers and civilians. The Tet Offensive had now shown its full power, not in territory gained or lost, but in the images burned into the minds of millions. Hue, once a symbol of Vietnam's past, had become a symbol of the war's futility. The guns eventually fell silent in Hue, and the Viet Cong units that had struck Saigon were gone. But the shock of Tet did not end with the last battle. In many ways, the offensive had only just begun to shape its true power. Not in Vietnam's jungles or ruined cities, but in the minds of Americans thousands of miles away. For years, Washington had promised progress. Each press briefing, each report from General Westmoreland spoke of body counts, of enemy losses, of steady victory. President Lyndon B. Johnson repeated the message to the public. America was on the right course, the war was under control, and success was only a matter of time. Tet shattered that illusion. The images on television were impossible to ignore. Americans had seen enemy fighters inside the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon. They had watched Marines pinned down in the streets of Hue. They had heard reporters speak of chaos, destruction, and shattered cities. Even though the attacks were eventually repelled, the very fact that they had happened at all left the public reeling. In February 1968, one of the most trusted voices in America stepped forward. Walter Cronkite, anchor of CBS News, had traveled to Vietnam himself. He walked through the ruins of Hue, spoke to soldiers, and saw the devastation firsthand. When he returned, he addressed his viewers in calm, steady words. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, yet unsatisfactory conclusion. Cronkite was no radical. He was respected by millions as an honest, middle-of-the-road journalist. His verdict carried enormous weight. When President Johnson heard of Cronkite's broadcast, he reportedly sighed, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." The political cost of Tet was immediate. Confidence in the war collapsed. Opinion polls showed a dramatic drop in support for Johnson's handling of Vietnam. Protests, already simmering, grew larger. On college campuses and in city streets, thousands marched with signs calling for an end to the war. The mood shifted from questioning strategy to demanding withdrawal. Inside the White House, Johnson faced not only public anger, but also pressure from within his own party. Senators and governors, once loyal, began to distance themselves. In March 1968, barely 2 months after Tet began, Johnson shocked the nation. In a televised address, after announcing a partial halt to bombing in North Vietnam, he ended with words no one expected: "I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president." For the United States, Tet had turned into a political earthquake. Militarily, the offensive was a failure for the communists. They suffered catastrophic losses, and the hoped-for uprising in the South never came. But politically, they achieved what years of fighting had not. They broke America's confidence in its own mission. The irony was sharp. On the battlefield, U.S. forces had inflicted devastating casualties. Yet the battle for perception was lost. The American people no longer believed victory was near. They saw a war without end, draining lives and resources, tearing the country apart. In North Vietnam, leaders understood this shift. Even as they counted their dead, they saw the protests in America, the crisis in Washington, the unraveling of Johnson's presidency. They concluded that time was on their side. If they could endure the losses, they could outlast the Americans. For American soldiers still in Vietnam, little changed immediately. Patrols continued, ambushes still came from the jungle, mortar rounds still fell on bases at night. But many of them sensed the shift. Letters from home spoke of protests, of families divided, of politicians arguing. Some soldiers wondered what they were truly fighting for. If back home people no longer believed in the war, Tet also exposed a deeper truth about modern conflict. Victory on the battlefield means little if the public no longer supports the fight. For Washington, the offensive was a lesson written in blood and broadcast on television. A reminder that in the age of mass media, perception could matter more than statistics. By the spring of 1968, the United States found itself at a crossroads. The war in Vietnam was far from over. In fact, It would grind on for 7 more years. But the Tet Offensive had already reshaped it. It had shown the limits of American power, the resilience of the Vietnamese, and the fragility of political will at home. What began as a surprise attack during a holiday had become a turning point in history. Tet revealed that the war was not simply fought in jungles and rice paddies, but in living rooms across America, where trust was broken and faith in victory dissolved. When the smoke cleared from Saigon, Hue, and dozens of other towns, the Tet Offensive left behind a landscape of ruins and a legacy of questions. Both sides had suffered, both claimed lessons, but neither emerged unchanged. For the United States, the numbers told one story. American and South Vietnamese forces had killed tens of thousands of enemy fighters. Viet Cong units across the South were decimated, their local networks shattered. On paper, it was a crushing defeat for the communists. Yet wars are not measured only in numbers. What Americans saw on their television screens told another story. Enemy troops storming their embassy, Marines fighting block by block in Hue, terrified civilians caught between armies. It did not look like victory. For a nation promised steady progress, it looked like endless war. In Hanoi, the story was equally complex. The leaders of North Vietnam had hoped for a general uprising in the South. They believed that the people, seeing the strength of the offensive, would rise against the Saigon government. That uprising never happened. Instead, their forces paid an enormous price, entire units wiped out, thousands of fighters gone forever. Even communist generals later admitted they had overestimated the readiness of the South. And yet, despite the military losses, Hanoi found reason to celebrate. The political shock inside the United States was exactly what they had hoped for. American leaders, who once spoke confidently of victory, now faced doubt, protest, and division. North Vietnam could lose battles on the ground, but if they won the war of perception, they believed they could still achieve their goal: unification under their rule. For the people of Vietnam, those who were neither generals nor presidents, Tet was a season of sorrow. Civilians suffered the most. In Hue, mass graves revealed the scale of the tragedy. Some were victims of executions carried out by communist forces, accused of collaborating with the South. Others were casualties of bombardment, trapped under the rubble of their homes. Families wandered through ruins searching for the missing, clutching photographs and scraps of clothing. In Saigon, residents recalled how the New Year festival turned overnight into a nightmare. Incense that had been lit to honor ancestors mixed with the smoke of burning buildings. Children who had prepared for celebration spent the night in basements, listening to gunfire above their heads. For many, Tet 1968 was remembered not as a holiday of renewal, but as the moment when innocence was lost. The offensive also marked a turning point in the role of the media in war. For the first time, Americans watched combat almost in real time, through nightly news broadcasts. The distance between battlefield and living room shrank to hours. Leaders could no longer control the narrative with press briefings. What people saw with their own eyes often contradicted official statements, eroding trust and deepening division at home. Politically, Tet reshaped America. President Johnson's decision not to run for re-election was only the most dramatic sign. In the months that followed, debates over Vietnam dominated the nation. Protests grew, the anti-war movement gained strength, and faith in government weakened. The war, once sold as a fight for freedom, now seemed to many as a quagmire without purpose. For soldiers on the ground, the lessons were more personal. Veterans of Hue and Saigon carried memories of house-to-house fighting, of comrades lost in alleyways, of civilians caught in crossfire. Many returned home to a country deeply divided, where their sacrifices were met not with parades, but with questions and protests. For Vietnam itself, Tet left deep scars. Cities and villages were rebuilt, but the memories lingered. Survivors remembered the executions, the bombings, the destruction of temples and homes. The cultural heart of Hue was permanently marked, its ruins standing as silent testimony to the cost of war. Looking back, historians often describe Tet as a paradox. It was a military disaster for the communists, yet a political triumph. It was a tactical victory for the United States, yet a strategic defeat. It showed how, in modern war, perception can outweigh battlefield results. But beyond strategies and statistics, Tet remains a human story. Of families hiding in fear, of soldiers fighting street by street, of leaders forced to confront realities they had long denied. The Tet Offensive did not end the Vietnam War. The fighting continued for years, claiming more lives, deepening divisions, and leaving wounds that remain even today. But Tet changed the course of that war. It revealed the limits of power, the strength of endurance, and the price paid when leaders underestimate both their enemies and their own people. In the end, Tet was not simply a battle. It was a mirror, reflecting the truths of a conflict that neither side fully understood, and a reminder that in war, the greatest victories and defeats are often found not on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of those who live through it.